What's up, design family, and welcome back to another episode of Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you back on the channel. Before we get started, if you guys are not subscribed, please consider doing so. We put out great content on a week-to-week basis, and it would mean the absolute world to us for you to join us along for the ride. On today's episode, we'll be giving a complete overview on one of the world's most widely used materials, leather. We'll be going through everything you ever wanted to know about leather, from the different types of leather, the different names of the leather depending on which part of the animal it's sourced from. We'll be looking at how leather quality is graded, and ultimately how each of these different classifications of leather are used in industry and their most common use case scenarios. So even if you know nothing about leather, you just know that it's a natural material, this is going to be a quick episode for you. It's going to introduce you to everything you wanted to know, and even if you know a little bit, I guarantee that there's going to be something in here that you're going to learn today. So without further ado, we're going to get right into the episode. Hey guys, and welcome to Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you here. On this channel, we discuss all things sports fashion, graphic design, manufacturing, and technology. We'll discuss key topics, answer pressing questions, and provide actionable steps on starting your own product line. If you're interested in any of the above topics, stick around. You're in for a good one. So what is leather? In short, leather is a material that's made out of the skin of an animal. And leather can come in different shapes, sizes, textures, porosity, depending on the animal that it's sourced from. There are a ton of different animals that can produce leather hides, but some of the most commonly well-known and used in the industry are going to be your cow full hide or your cow half hide. The key difference between a full and a half hide is essentially the quality. With a full hide, the hide that's sourced from the cow needs to be almost perfect. So if there's any imperfections on it, you have to throw out the hide or you have to get rid of half of the hide. With half of a hide, it doesn't need to be fully perfect as long as the key half, the one that you're going to use, is going to be the one that has minimal blemishing and is acceptable. So typically a full hide is more desirable. Also, bear in mind that with animals, the hides themselves have unique texturing and they have unique pore densities. So depending on the animal that you're taking from, one cow is not like the other. That's why it's desirable to have, let's just say, an entire interior or an entire handbag made out of the same hide as opposed to different hides, because those textures will arise. That's a little bit of a side note, but something to bear in mind when we're referencing full hides versus half hides. You also have your cow shoulder, you have your lamb full hide, which is quite popular, pig hide, and some more exotic hides are going to be something like the alligator hide or python skin. Of course, a lot of different leathers exist out there. There are things like ostrich, but that's not the purpose of this video. We're just trying to introduce you to the key hides and leathers that you see in the market. Next, we'll look at the hide itself and the parts of the hide and the types of leathers that it provides. Even within the same hide, not all parts of the same hide are created equal. So let's take a cow half hide, for example. Typically, the best part of that hide is considered to be the butt. This is a very small portion. Typically, it's around 5 to 10% of the internal hide or the entire hide. And it's just a lot more consistent, it's dense, and it's a lot more uniform. Then moving outwards from that, we have what is considered as good to fair. These are areas like the shoulder and the areas right around the rear portion of the hide. And then you have the worst part of the hide or the most undesirable part of the hide, which is considered to be the belly. This is an area that lacks texture, it lacks uniformity, and typically it's an area with a lot of blemishing and a lot of bruising. Because leather itself is a natural byproduct, we source it from animals who have all had lives and have all been exposed to the world. Chances are no leather hide is going to be completely perfect. We end up seeing a lot of imperfections in the hide itself. And depending on the life of that animal, there can be fewer or more imperfections. Some of the most common imperfections that we notice and we see on typical hides are going to be things like wrinkles. Just as with humans, as the cow gets older, for example, wrinkles are going to be appearing more and more often on the surface of the hide. Also, if the animal has been in a scuffle, if it's been hurt, scratches and even scars are definitely something that you want to look out for. And again, in the ecosystem of life, chances are these cows are going to get bitten, mosquitoes, so this is going to most likely leave blemishes, marks, and other insect bites. So we've discussed that leather can actually be subject to imperfections, mosquito bites, scars, and this definitely affects both the quality and the price of the leather. How do we grade leather based on these imperfections? Well, there is no one single uniform way, and it's quite a subjective process depending on the leather trader that's actually doing the certification, but there is a process for grading it, and it goes from A to F. And again, this is a subjective process and depends on who the person that's doing the grading is, what they're noticing, so on and so forth. But as a general rule of thumb, yes, the grading that you receive does affect quote unquote the price, but not necessarily the subjective quality of the hide itself. This grading system goes from A all the way to F, and A essentially means that there are absolutely no imperfections or scars on the detected hide. B allots for 5 to 10% of the surface area of the hide to be registered as having imperfections, scarring, so on and so forth. C is 10 to 20%. D is going to be 20 to 30. E is going to be 30 to 40. And finally, F means that the factory has rejected the hide, and this typically means that there's more than 40% of the surface area that's covered in some sort of detectable imperfections. So we've mentioned how leather is actually graded, but how is leather classified? Is all leather created equal, even from within the same hide itself? This is actually not true, and even within the same hide, you have different types of leather or different classifications of leather, depending on how deep into the epidermal layer you have to go to get the usable leather. So let's kind of identify what that means. The skin of any animal is a quite complex ecosystem, and there are layers and there are different parts of the skin. Depending on which part and which depth we get our leather from is what ultimately constitutes the quality of the leather. So starting from best to worst is the very top of the leather. So this is the grain, and this is what we consider as the full grain leather. Full grain leather is usually characterized by having a very consistent, dense, and almost like blemish-free kind of appearance. Also, it's not fibrous. The fibers are very tightly put together, and you don't see any of this sporadic texturing in the fabric or in the leather itself. Then just underneath that, you have your full grain leather. This is again a pretty good classification for leather, and it's still quite dense. The structure is still quite put together, and it's considered to be a very fair and very acceptable level of leather to use, even in some luxury goods, especially shoes. Then you have your top grain. This is one step right underneath it, or your split or your genuine leather, not your top grain, your split or genuine leather. This is the second to worst classification, which is funny because we typically take the idea of genuine leather as a hallmark of quality, which it isn't. And it just means that it's sourced from this layer of the epidermis. And here we start to see the structure of the leather or the skin start to break up a little bit. You start to see more fibers, and ultimately you start to see a lot less consistency in the leather itself. And then lastly, you have what is known as your reconstituted or your bonded leather. These are sourced from very undesirable areas of the animal, typically the belly, and they're bonded together using glue and other ways. And ultimately, it's not a very desirable part of the animal. You see it on very low-end products, on the soles of shoes that are made out of low-end manufacturers. So it's not something that I would recommend, but it does exist. Now that we know the different classifications, let's look at each in a little bit more detail. We mentioned that the full grain leather is by far the best. And here we have a 5-star quality rating. Typically, with this classification of leather, the entire grain layer, so the very top layer, is kept, and this adds a lot of strength and quality to the grain itself. And typically what we see here is the most natural appearance of the leather, the most true to form appearance of leather is seen when you have a full grain piece. This means that it requires no sanding, no buffing, and no cosmetic treatments to get the beauty and the luster out of the leather. And then lastly, it tends to develop a natural patina over time, which is quite desirable. And you typically see this in a lot of higher end goods. They tend to get better with time as they break in and they begin to develop this beautiful luster and patina, which is very, very desirable. Secondly, we have our top grain layer, and this layer is characterized by having the imperfections or the very thin grain layer completely removed, which usually means that you're going to need to sand and buff top grain leather in order to get the most out of it. It usually has a very smooth and lustrous appearance, but it does need to be corrected either using buffing, machining, or other kinds of treatments to get the most out of the leather. What are some variations that we see of top grain in the market? Well, corrected grain is very common. What this means is it's artificially treated to give it a grain and a texture. You're no longer seeing the obvious or the natural grain from the animal. You're seeing a man-made or a synthetic version of that pattern. Doesn't mean that the leather itself is not authentic. It just means that what you're seeing on the surface is not 100% true to the life and authenticity of the animal. So with your full grain, you're getting something a little bit more true to life. What are some variations we see? Well, your corrected grain, as I mentioned, means that we've actually taken that leather piece and we've embossed it with an actual pattern. This is also done to emulate or to imitate more exotic animals like alligator skin, snake skin, so on and so forth. The third classification, as we mentioned, is your split and your genuine leather. In this case, your top grain is completely removed. So here you're dealing with a completely different part of the actual hide. It's typical that a thicker hide can even produce different classifications of genuine leather. So not even all genuine leather is created equal. Depends on how deep into the hide you're having to go. This is a problem because genuine leather is no longer a hallmark of quality, and you can get a lot of variety within these same specifications or classifications. Also, genuine or your split leather is typically a lot weaker, it's a lot less durable, and it's pretty bad at repelling water. So unlike your full grain or your top grain, where you're getting something that's going to completely resist the effects of water, you're not getting this with your split. Some variations that we see on the market are things like suede, which is your split leather that is napped or brushed. Also, we tend to see patent leather or bycast leather, which is treated with this final treatment to get this very glossy effect. And there are a lot of different things you can do with genuine leather to give it different aesthetic appearances. And lastly, as we mentioned, we have our reconstituted or your bonded leather. And depending how this leather is treated, it can either have a smooth, full grain texture, or it can have no texture at all, depending on how it's actually processed. This is an amalgamation of scrap shreds of undesirable fabric pieces or leather pieces that are bonded together either using glue, latex, and other types of bonding adhesives. Depending on the content of the leather and the way it's processed, you can have as little as 10% of actual leather in a bonded or reconstituted leather piece. Also, if there's too little authentic or real leather in there, what you end up classifying this type of leather is as faux leather. And this depends. So not all types of reconstituted leather are going to be faux leather, but that doesn't mean that makes them a higher quality than a faux leather. Just bear that in mind. That's pretty much it, guys. That is a wrap on today's episode on everything that you probably wanted to know or maybe didn't even want to know about leather. Hopefully by now you should have a much clearer understanding of this material, what it's classified or how it's created, what different types of leathers that you have on the market, what are the different grading systems of each, and the way that we classify leather depending on which part of the grain we're actually getting that leather from. If you guys enjoyed this episode and learned a thing or two, please consider subscribing. We put out great content on a week-to-week basis, and it would mean the absolute world to us for you to join us along for the ride. Guys, thank you so much once again for tuning in to this episode of Fittdesign TV. Until next week's episode, stay awesome.